So it's another big week in Iran and the region around Iran, and of course the US and Israel. Lots going on. We have news today from Lebanon. We have negotiations on again, off again. Who knows? Who knows? And of course, where's Mujtaba? Leila, do you want to start us off with Lebanon? What's going on?
Yes, let's kick it off with Lebanon. Lebanon is taking a very rare step. They just revoked the accreditation of the Iranian ambassador, Mohammad Reza Shibani. And they told him that you should leave the country, and his deadline is March 29th.
And why? Why did they do that?
Okay. Because the Iranian ambassadors are not playing the role of diplomacy. They are part of IRGC, and they are aligned with Hezbollah. And this Shibani, he just was reappointed, replacing the former one, Mujtaba Amani, if you remember, who had been injured in 2024 with the Israeli pager operation, which shows you how close they are with Hezbollah, and they are really running the show with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So
what should one be reading into this, Leila? I kind of, we've all followed the history of Lebanon and how it became an extension of Iran's foreign policy. Hezbollah was an extension of the IRGC. Does this signify some historic break, and what brought this about? Because Lebanon is also, under assault in the south from Israel. So yes. I'm surprised that you would see this happen right now.
Yes, Matt. Iran and Lebanon, they go way back, and always this kind of diplomatic relationship was like more than a diplomatic relationship, especially with the two Shia parties, Amal and Hezbollah, who are really have the biggest voices in Shia community in Lebanon. So having the government of Salam saying that really made the two political parties so angry with Salam, and they were even talking about bringing down the government. So this is something huge in Lebanon. It goes beyond the personalities of the both ambassadors, because their role has always been different. There's always been talk about bringing money through the diplomatic case back and forth to Hezbollah. So, and recently we have seen some of the Iranian fleeing in Russian airplanes, and at the same time, these Iranian, not only the ambassador, people from IRG are being hunted by Israel in civilian areas. Usually, it's not occupied by Shia community; it's more occupied by Christians. So it's creating also a pressure from the streets in Lebanon. Please get them out. We don't need them. It is becoming so dangerous for the civilians, even between Lebanese and Lebanese. So the situation is much more complicated, really, than that.
So,
yeah, I think that's sort of what's amazing to see is in the Gulf, you have the saying now that for the first time in our history, we're in the same bunker with the Israelis. The Israelis started the war, but now we're both under attack. In fact, most of the missile attacks are on the Gulf countries. Only 15% hit Israel. It's hard for me to imagine that Lebanese have the same sentiment of, I wouldn't maybe go too far as call it a solidarity, but sort of a feeling of that we're in this with Israel, because again, Israel is attacking Lebanon and Iran is not attacking Lebanon.
The second part to your note, there was the second day after when they told the ambassador that he needs to leave the country, there was a missile that it was launched, and it was identified inside the airs of Lebanon. It was identified as an Iranian-made Qadr 110. It was launched from the Bekaa Valley, and according to security sources, and I think including sitcoms, it is the indication of coordination between IRGC and Hezbollah, but it was intercepted over Mount Lebanon by foreign air defenses. Likely, it's not confirmed, the US or British warship in the Mediterranean Sea. So, so there is an attack on Lebanon in a way from the Iranian or in its proxies. Is it on the embassy in Aukar, the US embassy? Nobody knows, but who was impacted because it was intercepted, the Lebanese. It was all over the northern Lebanon where the Christian areas.
This sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. I mean, if you look at, so Israel is moving in from the south, you have, the problem of Iranian proxies in Lebanon, and you have There have been reports of missiles falling across the Turkish border. We've heard about Azerbaijan. It just sounds like this is a tinderbox, and that one wrong thing could really set off something really big in the Middle East. I mean, it's framed generally as America and Israel versus Iran, with a bit of kind of a big sideshow with the Gulf countries. But there's so much going on. I mean, Lebanon really is a good example of how this thing has just spread to, a country that doesn't even border on Iran.
Yes.
But I don't see how you could have a kind of tinderbox if you really have one country, which is Iran, on one side, and then all the other countries on the other side. I'm willing to entertain that this will lead to something bigger, but for the last at least 10 years, I've always thought that conflict in the Middle East, unlike conflict in Europe or in Asia, would be confined to the Middle East. And you wouldn't have adversaries, because Iran doesn't have any natural allies. I mean, it has the Houthis, it's got Hezbollah, but it has no sovereign allies. And tell me how this would look. I don't know. Maybe I don't know.
I think I'm just seeing somebody making one wrong step. I don't know what it would look like, but I personally think that the Lebanon issue is really going to be big. I mean, because Israel doesn't feel safe, and it wants to have a zone that is going to keep it safe, and so on. And
the Israelis are extending where they want their borders, and they want their borders through the Litani River. And Smotrich was so plain about it 2 days ago, even though the Iranian, we heard that recently they added Lebanon to their terms of negotiation with the U.S. How this is going to play out, I don't know.
So Smotrich,
yes, the finance minister of Israel, yes.
Israel. Bezalel, okay. And why is his voice important here?
He is one of the strongest voices about protecting the northern parts of Israel. And he has been pushing for the war since the beginning, since he resumed office. So he was pushing on Hezbollah, ending Hezbollah since the beginning. So this is why his voice is important, especially now that you hear, like I watched today, a couple of places inside Israel complaining on Netanyahu. They need to end this war because there's a lot of casualties inside Israel. So this is internally important. In addition, that this is not going to help Netanyahu moving forward with any internal political agenda.
Well, it's good that you bring up Israel, because then now, yet another week of wondering, how do Israel and the U.S.'s interests diverge, and where are they congruent, which, we're going to in a moment get into the negotiations and who's talking to whom, who's allegedly talking to whom, and do the U.S. and Israel want the same thing right now? Do they want the same outcome? But
clearly they do not want the same outcome. I think you can say this for sure, that Israel has clarity about what it wants. And Bibi Netanyahu has been talking about this for decades. He thinks the regime is an existential threat to Israel and must be removed. And he is trying as hard as possible to do as much damage to the regime before his partner in Washington decides that the costs are too high to bear, and the economic and energy costs. And that's clearly foremost in mind politically in Washington, where Leila and I are. And I think that is what is, I think there's a tension between the two partners.
I think what Israeli fears, Matt, is that Washington could end the war too early without a comprehensive agreement. This is their biggest fear.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to see, when we get a definitive sense of what it is that's on the table, because, one of the things that obviously jumps out is what is apparently one of the 15 points from the U.S. is that Iran acknowledge Israel's right to exist. Well, I mean, the other 14 points don't really matter much if that is going to be something that is a demand of the U.S.
Well, the really interesting thing about this 15-point plan and the 5-point plan, which was the response from the Iranians, which includes things like reparations and sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz for Iran, is not the detail of the plan, but the fact that they have exchanged them. That signals that there is a desire in Tehran. This is also fits a pattern of past U.S. Iranian engagements where the U.S. says A, Iran says completely differently, but then there is that's just the opening hand, and that they are moving toward potentially some sort of détente. I think that there is the Gulf states, especially, are much closer to the Israeli position than the American position. Ironically enough, they obviously hate that it started without their consultation. It is calling into question their entire business model. Things felt pretty fragile in Saudi Arabia. It's really upended things in Qatar, but they are unified by one thing. They cannot allow this regime to come out of this stronger. And I think any sort of deal that comes with it, they will be pushing hard that Iran cannot have greater leverage over the region than it does right now. I think for the Israelis, they've set the nuclear program back, but until that regime is removed, that threat is always going to remain, that they're going to try and get breakouts. So I think we're really in a so the three parties, for me, are most important. The Europeans are a sideline. Washington, Israel, and the Gulf. No one is feeling very good if you put them on truth serum about where they are right now. And the longer it continues, the more I think it strengthens potentially the Israeli hand. The Iranian hand, because the Iranians have shown they can withstand.
And of course, it comes down to the Strait of Hormuz as well, because I mean, who ends up controlling that? And it's pretty clear that Iran has found out how much control they have over it and how they can kind of turn the faucet on or off at will. And that seems to be a point of great divergence. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they can possibly find an agreement on that. I mean, either Iran has a veto and a control over who gets through it, or they don't. And why would they give that up?
I mean, they would only give it up. They would only restore free shipping if they care about the destruction to their own economy. Obviously, Iran has nothing but oil exports to sustain itself. So if the Strait of Hormuz, I know there are Iranian ships going through, and in fact, Iranian exports are higher now than they were before. But presumably the U.S. could stop that immediately if it wanted to, but that would cause more havoc in the oil markets as it is. So I think that, again, if you get back to on a track that is leading toward détente, reopening the strait is the non-starter for everyone.
Like there were information, Andres, that the Iranian parliament is drafting a legislation to impose tolls and duties on ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. So yep. I think they are escalating. And from what I see from the 5 points and the 14 or 15 points from the US, absolutely there's nothing in common. It's very fundamental, this agreement. And my question is about the trust. The negotiation were going on and the war happened. So is there going to be a trust? That's why J.D. Vance, that Trump wants J.D. Vance part of these negotiations?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm puzzled on the J.D. Vance thing. I think J.D. Vance is trying to stay out of political harm's way here as long as possible, although these will be uncomfortable questions that will be asked in the 27th primary, assuming he is in there, and I guess depending how this all works out. Marco Rubio is also involved and in the room. But I think it's very hard for us because this conflict was not explained, and on purpose. It was a surprise attack, in a sense, on Iran, at least in the moment that it happened. The case for the war was not made clear, and therefore the end goals are not clear. And that used to be seen as something that was to Trump's advantage, that, he could choose when this stops. He could choose when to declare victory. But the Iranians have, I think, reminded us that they're a Persian culture. There's a saying from one of, from the security chief who was from Laranjani, who was assassinated. He had a line that Americans play American football and Iranians play chess. And they are playing chess. They're not playing the same game, and the Iranians are fighting back asymmetrically. And this is something that we don't see, that we, meaning we in the West, we, the U.S., did not prepare for ahead of time.
And speaking of whether there was preparation or not, we have the question again of who's running Iran. We had a great scoop from MBN about a war council, a triumvirate that's been appointed. Are they running the show? We have a new secretary of the National Security Council. Basically, Larijani's position has been split, and that was one of the important ones, was the secretary of the National Security Council. Arguably an important post, but if you have a wartime triumvirate, and of course, and this is all in the MBN newsletter, Iran newsletter this week, we have, of course, this is a country that has a president. Does the president have any power? Doesn't look like it right now. We have the supreme leader who, yet again, it's today's 18 days that he's been the supreme leader, still no sight of him, picture, sound, anything. So a lot of this comes back to who's running the show. I think the shorthand is the IRGC. I think everybody's pretty much agreed on that. Mm-hmm. But then, one of the things that everybody talks about is the fact that moderate voices have been taken out. And even the ones, as in literally, right? I mean, talk about decapitation. And the ones who haven't been taken out probably don't have a lot of voice right now, because what are they going to... There's not a lot of argument right now for somebody inside Iran and the regime to be saying that we need to be going softer. So it's and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with negotiations, because it's not as though the moderates or anybody who wants to find accommodation or is going to be at the table in these talks. Speaking of being at the table, it's worth mentioning, this came out in the newsletter again, in this wartime council, we had two people who have Interpol red notices attached to them because they were involved in a bombing that happened in a synagogue or a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires in the 1990s, over 30 years ago. And they're wanted. And in fact, this Zulqadr, who is now the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, he also is being sanctioned because he's been involved in the nuclear program. So we have some people who arguably can't even be sitting at the table with people from the West. But it continues to be a mess, and it's opaque. And as somebody who tries to follow what's going on in Iran, in Persian, in the Iranian press, the continuing blockout of the internet is very frustrating, because the tea leaves that you used to be able to read by just clicking on the domestic websites, those are all kind of in bad shape. You click and it just doesn't go through. So it's very opaque.
Yeah, I must say, like, this conflict was, if the Gaza war was the war for Instagram, it was a war of images, and the war of the images that were kind of there are no images, and this is a text war, actually. People are consuming this by reading. I know Leila thinks people don't read much anymore, but I think this conflict gives you the case for reading, because the only way to understand it is by trying to analyze it with words. I do think that MBN had a really interesting story earlier this week that really kind of spelled out what the triumvirate looks like, that also, Andres, you had in your newsletter yesterday. To no one's surprise, it is the IRGC Old Guard. It is someone who was named an IRGC commander at the age of 27 in 1981 to be an early head of the IRGC. I guess 5-time failed presidential candidate, so a source of some jokes, including his awkward dress style and sort of weird belt buckle. I mean, these are really hard men, right? And I think we assume that these are men who are not going to be. I mean, Larijani was the one who was seen as the more pragmatist in that group, and he's no longer.
And he's gone, and it's that's the thing. I cannot imagine right now that there's a voice in the room who's going to be arguing for anything but a maximalist position. And yet, of course, as we've been talking about in this podcast, there's a lot of reason for Iran to come to the table and give up some stuff. But it's, frankly, why are they ever going to agree not to develop the nuclear program now? I mean, that's going to be an interesting one. And that's a big one, obviously, for the U.S. It's...
So you're speaking as if it's a kind of, and I'm curious for the both of you, I think last week there was a sense of, and I just want to preempt this by saying it is barely 4 weeks into this conflict. And my old colleague Brett Stevens had a really good piece in the New York Times about how, compared to any other conflict, this one is doing much better than people realize in terms of casualties, in terms of the ability of the U.S. to completely degrade Iran's military capability. All that said, that regime seems to be in power. Do you think now that this regime is less likely to fall than you did last week? It doesn't seem even to be part of the conversation, and certainly Trump is not making that part of the conversation or part of the
I'll tell you what I think. We had a sign, and we have had signs. They don't have free and open elections, but we know the Iranian people are not happy with this regime, and that's putting it mildly. And if we recall, it's almost to the day 3 months ago that the shopkeepers, the bazaris, closed up shop in protest at the plummeting of the value of the national currency, the rial. At the end of the day, war aside, of course, that's a big thing to set aside, leadership changes, this and that. The catalyst for the unrest, if you put aside the politics and the terrible things that Iranians go through on a daily basis by living under a very harsh regime that hangs people constantly and doesn't tolerate any dissent. If the economy is a disaster, people are not going to be happy. There's a limit to how much people will want to suffer under a regime that can't deliver when it comes to daily goods and so on. Yeah, the regime will be able to use the excuse, just as the Soviet Union did, and blaming a lot of what actually that you could fault communism for, they blamed on the Second World War. You can only take that so far. This regime is not going to be able to sustain itself just by saying that, oh yeah, well, the rial is essentially worthless now because of the war. People are going to be like, yeah, okay, but so the war is over. What are you going to do about it? I personally don't think that the regime is going to be able to last. It's been around for 47 years, but it's never been through this. And whatever it's going to look like, I don't know, but I don't think it's going to last.
But Anders, when?
Well,
we've been talking about this, and we've been seeing a lot of inside voices. They went to the streets, they were oppressed. But at the same time, this time, coming from Lebanon and seeing the country being destroyed, they are watching their country as well being destroyed. Because of the regime or not, the end game is their country is being destroyed. So, and some of the generations, they were born under this regime. So the Iranian, I think they are suffocating between this and that, and they are the victim of that. So the sooner this regime falls, the better for the Iranian people, before it's better for everybody else.
So true. So true. One of the things is we talk about the newsletter. There are a couple of things that talk about what governments do and don't do for their people. In this week's Iran newsletter, I talk about the fact that countries offer different amounts of support, even in wartime, to their own people. So in Israel, there are alerts. Basically, as soon as something, incoming, a missile is coming over the border, there's a whole system that tracks it. There are apps, people get warnings, and they have shelters.
Yes.
And then, the Gulf, you kind of have a middle ground because you do have some warning systems. They've had a lot of PR campaigns, kind of communications campaigns about, beware and so on. But they also don't actually have kind of an integrated shelter structure, certainly nothing like Israel does. But most interesting, ultimately, is that, if Iran is surrounded by these enemies, and it's, created the enemies,
and they have never done anything for the future. If they went into war, they just focused on building missiles or nuclear weapons. So they haven't thought about, agreed.
Exactly. No civilian alert system. I mean, there's, if you care so much about your people, well, you could find a way to actually warn them. And no shelters. So basically, it has abandoned its people and not prepared in any way for a possible war.
This regime cares about its survival. That's personally what I think.
And most authoritarian regimes have one priority only, which is how not to get their heads chopped off. And so they're willing to do a lot of damage. Thinking back, I was in Serbia in 2000. and covered Kosovo in 1999, and it's not relevant only in the sense that the bombing campaign against Milosevic was in spring of 1999, of Slobodan Milosevic, strongman in Serbia, country was isolated. The bombing campaign did unify the country, and it feel like, oh, it strengthened Milosevic. Within a year, he had been toppled because that sense of frustration and some similar dynamics, young population, student movement, frustration with being isolated from the wider world, frustration with feeling that your your sort of nation's potential has been, in their case, for a decade, suppressed by just bad leaders, a bad leader. In Iran, you've got 50 years now of a very proud culture that has been under a kind of, it'd be hard to kind of come up in a laboratory with a worse sort of regime than the mix of theocracy and corruption and kind of an elite privilege and cruelty than you see in Iran. But that also makes it why it's so difficult to dislodge. And I do worry that there was no, when I was in Dubai just before the war started, talking to people, there was an assumption that, oh, surely the Americans and the Israelis are talking to the mayor of Tehran. They are identifying people who could, come in and displace the hard men that we're seeing clearly in charge right now. And whether they were or not, who knows, talking to these people, but those plans certainly aren't evident in any way. Some patience could be required, and we could look back on this in a few weeks and think we were too pessimistic. But as of right now, I think the current trajectory, at least from Washington, is this last couple more weeks, we get some sort of détente. This regime does stay in place. This regime could end up coming out of this stronger than weaker, in the sense that it's shown that it can hold on against the most powerful country in the world. And it still has, maybe the breakout capability is longer down the line, but the problem will not have been solved. And I think that would be a terrible outcome for people in the Gulf and in Israel. And
building on that concept of kind of making predictions and where this is going to go, there is a piece in the Iran newsletter this week as well about the online betting market. Apparently over $1 billion have been traded about this. Basically, people have been making online predictions and bets about what's going to happen to the supreme leader. And there was one documented case of an Israeli journalist who was receiving death threats because he reported on Iranian missiles coming into Israel, and apparently people were disputing whether or not the debris that fell was actually from missiles or not. And apparently the outcome of the bet rode on whether or not these were Iranian missiles or something else. And people, they didn't like his reporting because what he reported didn't fit in with what their bet was riding on. It's a whole messy thing about people have been trying to make money. Insider trading accusations. That's a whole other world. Yet another kind of casualty of this war that's unintended is money trading.
How much? I think it's not a casualty. I think it's just, first of all, it's how we have it's a fairly efficient, or at least gives you some window into what the sentiment is. And you kind of need insider traders to make sure that that sentiment is more right than not. And if there's money to be made, it's only human that people are going to try.
Well, we're not making money from this, but we'll see how our predictions do come true. Yeah. I want to thank you both for a rousing discussion, and I can't wait till the next one and see, maybe this will be over.
Fingers crossed. Inshallah.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.